In the summer of 2019, 17-year-old Bianca Michelle Devins was living the life of any typical teenager in Utica, New York. She was creative, artistic, and beloved by her family and friends. On July 13th, she prepared for what seemed like an ordinary evening at a concert in New York City with 21-year-old Brandon Andrew Clark, someone she had met online. But as their car returned home in the early hours of July 14th, a private argument escalated into unthinkable violence. In one devastating moment, Bianca's bright future was stolen away. Then Clark did something that shocked even seasoned investigators. He photographed her body and posted the images online for the world to see. What followed was a 2-year legal battle that tore a grieving family apart as Clark attempted to withdraw his guilty plea and escape justice. Through court delays, viral trauma, and public horror, one mother's fight for accountability would spark a national conversation about digital violence and platform responsibility. But would justice finally come for Bianca Michelle Devins? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The evening air in Utica carried the familiar sounds of summer. Lawnmowers hummed in distant yards. Children's laughter echoed from playgrounds. Screen doors slammed as families gathered for dinner. Inside the Devins home, 17-year-old Bianca Michelle Devins stood before her bedroom mirror, preparing for a night out. Her artistic soul showed in everything around her: sketches pinned to walls, colorful clothing scattered across her bed, creative projects in various stages of completion. "You look beautiful, honey," her mother Kim said from the doorway, watching her daughter apply the finishing touches to her makeup. Bianca smiled, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Thanks, Mom. I'm really excited about this concert." She had been talking about the show for weeks. It was in New York City, a chance to see one of her favorite artists perform live. Going with Brandon Andrew Clark, someone she had connected with online, seemed like the perfect way to experience the music she loved. Kim felt the familiar mix of maternal pride and concern as she watched her daughter. Bianca was growing up, making her own choices, building her own relationships. It was natural for a 17-year-old to want independence, to explore the world beyond their small town. "Remember to text me when you get there," Kim said, giving her daughter a hug. "I will," Bianca promised, grabbing her small purse and checking that her phone was charged. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, Kim could see Brandon Clark behind the wheel. He was 21, older than Bianca, but that wasn't unusual for teenagers dating. He seemed polite enough during their brief meetings. Bianca kissed her mother goodbye and headed for the door. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart. Have fun." Kim watched from the window as her daughter walked to the car, her step light with excitement. Bianca waved as she climbed into the passenger seat, her face glowing with the anticipation of a perfect night ahead. The car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet street, carrying Bianca toward what should have been just another teenage memory. The venue throbbed with energy. Hundreds of young people pressed together in the darkened space, their voices rising in unison with the music. Colored lights swept across the crowd, creating a kaleidoscope of movement and sound. Bianca felt alive in the chaos. This was her element, surrounded by music, creativity, and shared passion. She sang along to every word, her hands raised toward the stage, completely absorbed in the performance. Brandon Clark stood beside her, but his attention seemed divided. While Bianca lost herself in the music, he watched the crowd around them, his eyes tracking other concertgoers who spoke to her or smiled in her direction. "This is amazing," Bianca shouted over the music, turning to share her excitement with him. Clark forced a smile and nodded, but there was something tight around his eyes, something that didn't match the celebratory atmosphere surrounding them. As the night progressed, his mood seemed to darken. When fans approached Bianca for photos or conversations about the artist, Clark positioned himself closer to her, his body language increasingly possessive. Bianca, caught up in the magic of live music, didn't notice the change. She took selfies, chatted with other fans, and absorbed every moment of the concert experience she had been anticipating for so long. The final song ended to thunderous applause. The lights came up, revealing hundreds of sweaty, smiling faces. Bianca's cheeks were flushed with excitement as she turned to Clark. "That was incredible. Thank you so much for bringing me." But Clark's expression had hardened. The easy conversation they had shared during the drive to the city was gone, replaced by a cold distance that Bianca couldn't understand. As they pushed through the crowd toward the exit, Clark's silence deepened. Bianca tried to engage him in conversation about the show, but his responses were clipped, almost hostile. The summer air outside felt cool after the heat of the packed venue. Around them, other concertgoers lingered on the sidewalks, still buzzing with post-show energy. Groups of friends made plans for late-night food, couples held hands as they walked toward subway stations. Bianca and Clark moved toward his car in uncomfortable silence. The joy Bianca had felt during the concert began to fade, replaced by confusion and growing unease. Something had changed during those hours of music and lights. Something that would make the long drive back to Utica very different from the anticipatory journey into the city. The highway stretched ahead of them in the darkness, lit only by occasional streetlights and the headlights of passing cars. Most of the traffic had thinned out, leaving long stretches of empty road between Utica and New York City. Inside Clark's car, the atmosphere had grown increasingly tense. What had started as uncomfortable silence had evolved into something more dangerous. "You were flirting with everyone there," Clark said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Bianca looked at him in surprise. "What? No, I wasn't. I was just enjoying the music. I saw how you were looking at other people, taking pictures with them. Brandon, I was just being friendly. It's a concert, people talk to each other." But Clark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. His accusations came faster now, each one more intense than the last. He spoke about her online presence, her interactions with other people, his belief that she was deliberately trying to hurt him. Bianca's confusion turned to alarm as his voice rose. This wasn't the person she thought she knew. This wasn't the online connection that had seemed so genuine and caring. "You're scaring me," she said quietly. "You should be scared," Clark replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The miles passed in increasingly hostile silence. Bianca stared out the passenger window at the darkness, her mind racing. She thought about texting her mother, but what would she say? That her date was acting strangely? That she felt uncomfortable? She had no way of knowing that this car ride would be analyzed by investigators, that GPS data would track their route, that these would be her final hours of life. Clark pulled off the highway onto a less traveled road. The streetlights disappeared, leaving them in near-complete darkness except for the car's headlights. "Where are we going?" Bianca asked, her voice tight with fear. "We need to talk," Clark said. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional passing car in the distance. Bianca's hand moved toward her phone, but Clark noticed the movement immediately. "Don't," he said. In that moment, 17-year-old Bianca Michelle Devins realized she was in terrible danger. The darkness outside the car was complete now. No streetlights, no houses, just the occasional sweep of headlights from passing vehicles on the distant highway. Inside the car, Clark's accusations had escalated beyond reason. He spoke about betrayal, about relationships that existed only in his mind, about perceived slights that made no sense to anyone but him. Bianca tried to reason with him, to calm the situation down, but her words only seemed to fuel his rage. He had constructed an elaborate narrative of jealousy and possession that had no basis in reality. "I just want to go home," Bianca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get to go home," Clark replied. In that moment, his fantasy of control collided with the reality that Bianca was her own person, with her own thoughts, relationships, and autonomy. The collision was devastating. The violence came suddenly and without warning. One moment they were talking, and the next, Clark had produced a knife. Bianca's scream pierced the night air, but there was no one around to hear it. She fought. Despite her fear, despite the impossibility of the situation, 17-year-old Bianca Michelle Devins fought for her life. But she was trapped in a car with someone much larger and stronger, someone who had planned this moment even if he couldn't admit it to himself. The attack lasted only minutes, but those minutes erased a lifetime of possibilities. Gone were the college applications Bianca had been preparing. Gone were the artistic projects she would never complete. Gone were the relationships she would never build, the children she would never have, the impact she would never make on the world. When it was over, Clark sat in the silence that followed violence. Bianca's body was still, her creative spirit extinguished by someone who had claimed to care about her. But Clark wasn't finished. In a decision that would shock even experienced investigators, he reached for his phone and began taking photographs of what he had done. The images he captured would become evidence in his prosecution. They would also become weapons that he would use to extend his cruelty far beyond that dark roadside, turning Bianca's most vulnerable moment into a public spectacle. The teenager who had left her mother's house just hours earlier, excited about a night of music and friendship, was gone. In her place was a crime scene that would haunt everyone who encountered it. With Bianca's body still in the car beside him, Brandon Andrew Clark made a decision that would define how the world remembered her final moments. He took out his phone and began documenting what he had done. The photographs were graphic and disturbing. They showed a young woman's life reduced to violence, her dignity stripped away by someone who claimed to have cared about her. But Clark wasn't taking them for evidence or confession, he was taking them as trophies. Then he did something that shocked even veteran law enforcement officers who thought they had seen everything. He began posting the images online. Clark uploaded the photos to various social media platforms, including Discord and Instagram. Some he sent directly to people who knew Bianca. Others he posted publicly, accompanied by captions that revealed his twisted justification for what he had done. The post spread quickly through online communities where Bianca had been active. Her friends and followers, expecting typical social media content, instead encountered the most traumatic images imaginable. Within minutes, the platforms were flooded with reports and desperate attempts to have the content removed. But the damage was already done. Screenshots were being saved and reshared. The images that should have been seen only by investigators and jury members were now circulating among teenagers and strangers across the internet. Clark seemed to take satisfaction in the chaos he was creating. He had murdered Bianca in private, but now he was murdering her dignity in public, ensuring that her death would be remembered not for her life's potential, but for its violent end. Some online users who saw the posts immediately contacted authorities. Others tried to track down Bianca's family to warn them before they could encounter the images accidentally. But there was no way to contain the horror Clark had unleashed. As he sat in his car with Bianca's body, continuing to document and share his crime, Clark had no way of knowing that these same images would become the evidence that ensured his conviction. His desire to showcase his control had created a digital trail that investigators would follow directly to him. The online posts marked a new chapter in digital violence, one where murder extended far beyond its initial victim to traumatize hundreds or thousands of additional people who had simply been using social media on what they expected to be an ordinary night. The first calls came from people who had never met Bianca Michelle Devins but felt compelled to act when they saw the horrific images Clark had posted online. In homes across Utica and beyond, teenagers were putting down their phones and running to find their parents. Young people who had been casually scrolling through social media suddenly found themselves witnesses to a murder, their normal evenings shattered by images no one should ever see. "Mom, something terrible has happened," became a refrain in dozens of households as the post spread. Parents who barely understood social media found themselves trying to comfort children who had seen something that would haunt them forever. The trauma wasn't limited to Bianca's immediate circle, it was radiating outward through digital networks, affecting anyone unlucky enough to encounter Clark's posts. The 911 calls began within the first hour. Callers struggled to explain what they had seen, their voices shaking as they tried to provide useful information to dispatchers. "I saw photos on Instagram. I think someone has been murdered," one caller reported, their voice barely steady. "There are pictures online of a girl who looks like she's been killed. I think it's real," said another. Each call was logged, creating a digital paper trail that investigators would later use to establish the timeline of Clark's actions. The callers provided screenshots, usernames, and platform information that would become crucial evidence. But the calls weren't just from strangers. As the images spread, they began reaching people who actually knew Bianca. Friends from school opened their phones to find their classmates' death displayed in graphic detail. Online acquaintances who had shared art and music with her were confronted with images of her murder. The horror was amplified by the medium itself. Social media was supposed to be a place for connection, creativity, and joy, the kind of space where Bianca had thrived. Now it had become the vehicle for extending her suffering beyond death. In the Devins household, Kim was getting ready for bed when her phone began ringing. The first call was from a friend who had seen something online, then another, then another. Each caller struggled with how to deliver the news. How do you tell a mother that her daughter has been murdered? How do you explain that the evidence is spreading across the internet for everyone to see? By the time Kim fully understood what was happening, law enforcement was already mobilizing to find Clark and confirm what the online evidence suggested. The community that had watched Bianca grow up was about to learn that one of their own had been taken in the most brutal way imaginable. The 911 calls had provided law enforcement with crucial information about Clark's location and the evidence he had posted online. Using GPS data and social media analytics, investigators were able to track him down while he was still at the scene of the crime. When police arrived at the remote location where Clark had pulled off the road, they found him sitting beside his car in a state that could only be described as detached from reality. Bianca's body was still visible in the vehicle, exactly as he had photographed it for his online posts. Clark appeared to be in shock, but not from grief or regret. He seemed surprised that law enforcement had found him so quickly, as if he hadn't considered that posting evidence of murder online would lead directly to his arrest. "Don't move," officers commanded as they approached the scene. But Clark wasn't interested in cooperation. As police closed in, he pulled out the same knife he had used to kill Bianca and turned it on himself. In a final act of manipulation, he attempted suicide not from remorse, but as a way to maintain control over the narrative he had created. The self-inflicted wounds were severe but not fatal. Officers immediately called for medical assistance while securing the crime scene. As paramedics worked to stabilize Clark, investigators began the careful process of documenting everything they found. The evidence was overwhelming. Clark's phone contained not only the images he had posted online, but also additional photos and digital communications that established his relationship with Bianca and his state of mind leading up to the murder. Bianca's body told its own story. The medical examiner would later determine that she had fought for her life, that she had tried to defend herself against someone she had trusted enough to get in a car with. As Clark was transported to the hospital under police guard, the reality of what he had done began to set in for the first responders who had found them. These were experienced law enforcement officers and medical personnel, but the combination of the violent crime and the digital spectacle Clark had created was unlike anything they had encountered. The arrest happened within hours of Bianca's murder, thanks to the same online post that had traumatized so many people. Clark's desire to showcase his crime had led directly to his capture, ensuring that there would be no mystery about what had happened or who was responsible. But while the investigation was straightforward, the legal process that would follow would be anything but simple. The evidence against Brandon Andrew Clark was more comprehensive than in most murder cases. His decision to document and broadcast his crime had created a digital trail that investigators could follow with unprecedented precision. Clark's phone contained hundreds of pieces of evidence. Beyond the graphic images he had posted online, there were text messages, social media conversations, and search histories that revealed his state of mind in the days and weeks leading up to the murder. The digital forensics team found evidence of Clark's obsessive behavior toward Bianca. He had saved screenshots of her social media posts, documented her interactions with other people, and created elaborate fantasies about their relationship that bore no resemblance to reality. GPS data from his phone confirmed the timeline investigators had constructed. They could track his movements from Utica to New York City, to the concert venue, and finally to the remote location where he had murdered Bianca. The social media posts themselves provided irrefutable evidence of Clark's actions and mental state. The captions he had written alongside the images revealed his twisted justifications and his desire to cause maximum trauma to everyone who had cared about Bianca. But perhaps most damning was the timeline. The digital evidence showed that Clark had begun posting images within minutes of the murder. There was no cooling-off period, no moment of regret or reconsideration. He had transitioned seamlessly from killing Bianca to exploiting her death for attention. Investigators also found evidence that Clark had researched similar crimes online, suggesting premeditation despite his later claims that the murder was impulsive. His browser history revealed searches for information about murder methods, legal consequences, and media coverage of similar cases. The physical evidence at the crime scene corroborated everything the digital investigation had revealed. Bianca's injuries were consistent with the weapon Clark had used on himself. DNA evidence confirmed that he had been the one to attack her. For prosecutors, the case was as straightforward as a murder case could be. They had a suspect who had documented his own crime in graphic detail, a clear timeline of events, overwhelming physical evidence, and hundreds of digital witnesses who had seen Clark's posts. The evidence package was so comprehensive that Clark's eventual guilty plea seemed inevitable. What no one anticipated was that he would later attempt to withdraw that plea, forcing Bianca's family to endure years of additional trauma as he tried to escape the consequences of his actions. But in those first days after the arrest, as investigators compiled their evidence and prepared their case, justice seemed assured. The teenager who had left her home excited about a concert would finally have someone held accountable for taking her life. Utica had never seen anything like Bianca Michelle Devins' funeral. The small church was packed beyond capacity, with mourners spilling out into the parking lot and onto the surrounding streets. Teenagers who had known her from school sat next to adults who had only learned her name through the horror of her death. Kim Devins stood at the front of the church, looking out at the sea of faces that had gathered to honor her daughter. Some she recognized family members, close friends, teachers who had watched Bianca grow up, Others were complete strangers who felt compelled to pay their respects to a young woman whose life had been cut short in such a public and traumatic way. The memorial program featured one of Bianca's own artistic creations on the cover, a colorful drawing that showcased the creativity and joy that had defined her short life. Inside were photographs that captured her personality, laughing with friends, working on art projects, being a typical teenager with hopes and dreams for the future. Bianca was more than what happened to her, Kim said during her eulogy, her voice strong despite the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. She was an artist, a friend, a daughter who brought light into every room she entered. That's how I want her to be remembered. The service was punctuated by sobs from teenagers who were experiencing loss for the first time. Many of them had seen the images Clark posted online, adding a layer of trauma to their grief that no young person should have to carry. Local news cameras remained respectfully distant, but their presence served as a reminder that Bianca's death had become more than a personal tragedy. It had become a symbol of digital age violence, of the ways that social media could amplify harm beyond anything previous generations had experienced. After the service, hundreds of people gathered in the cemetery for the burial. The gravesite was covered in flowers, artwork, and personal notes from people whose lives Bianca had touched. Some mourners had traveled from other states, drawn by a connection they felt to a story that had affected them deeply. As dirt was thrown over the casket, Kim made a silent promise to her daughter. Bianca's story wouldn't end with her death. Her memory would become a force for change, a way to protect other young people from the kind of violence that had taken her life. The funeral marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The immediate shock of Bianca's murder was giving way to the long process of seeking justice and meaning from senseless loss. But even as the community came together to mourn, Brandon Andrew Clark remained in custody, beginning what would become a drawn-out legal process that would reopen wounds and test everyone's faith in the justice system. The courthouse in Utica had seen many criminal proceedings over the years, but the case of People v. Brandon Andrew Clark drew an unusual level of attention. Media outlets from across the country sent reporters to cover what had become a national story about digital violence and teenage vulnerability. Kim Devins sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, flanked by family members and victim advocates. She had dressed carefully for the hearing, wanting to present herself with dignity while facing the person who had murdered her daughter. When Clark was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. Where Bianca's family radiated grace under unimaginable pressure, Clark appeared disheveled and detached. His suicide attempt had left visible scars, but there was no indication that he felt genuine remorse for what he had done to Bianca. The charges were read aloud: murder in the second degree, a felony that carried a potential sentence of 25 years to life in prison. The prosecutor outlined the evidence against Clark in clinical terms: the digital documentation, the physical evidence, the timeline that established his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Clark's defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty, setting the stage for what everyone assumed would be a lengthy trial. The evidence was overwhelming, but defense lawyers have an obligation to represent their clients zealously, even in cases where guilt seems obvious. "Your Honor, we understand the community's desire for swift justice," the defense attorney said, "but Mr. Clark is entitled to due process, and we intend to ensure he receives it." Outside the courthouse after the hearing, media representatives surrounded Kim Devins with questions. She handled the attention with remarkable composure, focusing on her daughter's memory rather than the legal process ahead. "I'm not here for revenge," she told reporters. "I'm here to make sure Bianca gets justice, and to make sure other families don't have to go through what we've been through." The hearing lasted less than an hour, but it marked the official beginning of a legal process that would consume the next 2 years. What seemed like a straightforward case, a defendant who had documented his own crime, would become a test of the family's endurance and the justice system's ability to provide closure. As Kim left the courthouse that day, she believed the hardest part was behind her. She had buried her daughter and faced her killer in court. The trial would be difficult, but at least it would bring finality to their ordeal. She had no way of knowing that Clark would soon change his strategy in a way that would extend her suffering far beyond what anyone thought possible. Even after Brandon Andrew Clark's arrest, the images he had posted of Bianca's murder continued to spread across the internet. What began as posts on a few platforms quickly metastasized across the entire digital ecosystem, appearing on sites that Clark himself had never used. Social media companies found themselves facing an unprecedented challenge. They had policies for removing violent content, but nothing in their guidelines had anticipated a case where the perpetrator himself was broadcasting his crime in real time to maximize trauma and attention. Facebook, Instagram, Discord, and other platforms began removing the images as quickly as they found them, but new copies appeared faster than content moderators could work. Users were saving screenshots and reposting them with new captions. Some were sharing the images out of morbid curiosity, others claimed they were trying to preserve evidence, and still others seemed motivated by the same desire for attention that had driven Clark to post them originally. For Bianca's family and friends, the continued circulation of these images was a form of ongoing violence. Every time someone shared them, it felt like losing her again. The private grief that should have been theirs was being commodified by strangers who had never known Bianca as a living person. Kim Devins began receiving messages from people around the world who had seen the images. Some expressed sympathy and support. Others shared disturbing reactions that revealed the worst aspects of internet culture. The anonymity of online platforms emboldened people to say things they would never say to a grieving mother in person. "I just want them to stop," Kim said during an interview with a local news station. "My daughter was a beautiful, creative person. She shouldn't be remembered for these horrible images. She should be remembered for her art, her kindness, her dreams." But the platforms seemed unable or unwilling to completely remove the content. Their algorithms weren't designed for this type of crisis, and their human moderators were overwhelmed by the volume of reports. Each day brought new variations and new attempts to circumvent content filters. The family consulted with attorneys about potential legal action against the platforms. While the law generally protected social media companies from liability for user-generated content, some legal experts suggested that their failure to remove the images, despite clear policy violations, might create an opening for civil suits. Tech policy advocates seized on Bianca's case as an example of the need for stronger regulation of online platforms. They argued that companies that profited from user engagement had a responsibility to protect users from traumatic content, especially when that content depicted actual violence. The online battle would continue for months, creating additional trauma for Bianca's loved ones and raising questions about the responsibilities of tech companies in the digital age. But in the immediate aftermath of Clark's arrest, Kim Devins was focused on a more pressing concern, ensuring that he was held accountable for what he had done. 8 months after Bianca Michelle Devins was murdered, Brandon Andrew Clark appeared in court and did something that surprised almost everyone involved in the case. He changed his plea to guilty. Standing before Judge Michael Dwyer, Clark spoke in a quiet voice as he admitted to murdering Bianca. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no lengthy process of evidence presentation, no opportunity for his defense team to create doubt about his responsibility for the crime. "Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are admitting that you committed this crime?" Judge Dwyer asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Clark replied. For Kim Devins, sitting in the courtroom gallery, the moment felt surreal. After months of anticipating a difficult trial, the legal process seemed to be reaching a conclusion much more quickly than anyone had expected. The prosecutor outlined the evidence against Clark as part of the plea hearing. The digital documentation, the physical evidence, the timeline, all of it painted a picture of premeditated violence followed by deliberate cruelty in posting the images online. Mr. Clark not only took Bianca's life, but he violated her dignity by sharing images of her death with the world, the prosecutor told the court. His actions traumatized not just her family and friends, but hundreds of strangers who were forced to witness his crime. Clark's defense attorney acknowledged the strength of the prosecution's case and indicated that his client understood the consequences of his plea. Under New York law, the guilty plea to second-degree murder would likely result in a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. Outside the courthouse after the hearing, Kim spoke to reporters with a mixture of relief and ongoing pain. The guilty plea meant she wouldn't have to sit through weeks of testimony about her daughter's final moments, wouldn't have to see the evidence presented in graphic detail, wouldn't have to worry about the possibility of acquittal. "Today brings us one step closer to justice for Bianca," she said. "While nothing can bring my daughter back, knowing that her killer has admitted his guilt provides some measure of closure for our family." The plea hearing was covered extensively in local and national media. Legal experts praised the prosecutor's ability to secure a guilty plea in such a high-profile case, noting that it would spare the community and the victim's family the trauma of a lengthy trial. But the relief Kim felt that day would prove to be temporary. Within months, Clark's legal strategy would change again. plunging the family back into uncertainty and extending their ordeal far beyond what they had imagined possible. The guilty plea that had seemed like the end of their legal nightmare would turn out to be just another chapter in a story that was far from over. The motion arrived in late 2020, like a devastating blow to a family that thought their legal ordeal was nearing its end. Brandon Andrew Clark, through his attorneys, was requesting permission to withdraw his guilty plea and proceed to trial. The legal document was filled with technical language about ineffective counsel and insufficient consideration of mental health issues, but its effect on Kim Devins was immediate and crushing. Her daughter's killer was trying to escape responsibility for his actions, forcing the family back into a legal limbo they thought they had left behind. "I can't believe this is happening," Kim said as she read through the motion with the prosecutor assigned to the case. "He confessed. He pleaded guilty. How can he just change his mind?" The law does allow defendants to withdraw guilty pleas under certain circumstances, usually involving claims that the original plea was not entered knowingly and voluntarily. Clark's attorneys argued that he had not been properly evaluated for mental health issues that might have affected his ability to understand the consequences of his plea. For the prosecution, the motion was disappointing but not entirely unexpected. High-profile defendants often attempt multiple legal strategies, especially when facing lengthy prison sentences. The evidence against Clark remained overwhelming, but a plea withdrawal would mean returning to the possibility of a trial. Judge Dwyer scheduled hearings to consider the motion, but court schedules were already disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. What might have been resolved quickly in normal circumstances was now subject to delays and postponements that would drag the process out for months. Kim found herself reliving the trauma of her daughter's death with each court filing. The motion included references to the crime scene, to Clark's mental state, and to the evidence that had been gathered, all painful reminders of the night that had destroyed her family's life. The media attention that had died down after the guilty plea returned with renewed intensity. Legal experts debated the likelihood that Clark would be allowed to withdraw his plea, with most suggesting that the evidence against him was too strong to make a trial strategy viable. But for Kim, the expert opinions didn't matter. What mattered was that her daughter's killer was trying to escape accountability, and that meant more months or possibly years of uncertainty, court hearings, and public attention focused on the worst moments of their lives. "Bianca deserves justice," Kim said in a statement to reporters. "We won't let her killer manipulate the system to avoid responsibility for what he did. We'll fight this every step of the way." The plea withdrawal attempt marked the beginning of a new phase in their legal battle, one that would test the family's resilience and the justice system's ability to provide closure to victims' families. The straightforward case that had seemed to be resolved was now anything but simple. The COVID-19 pandemic brought court systems across the country to a virtual standstill, and the case against Brandon Andrew Clark was no exception. What should have been prompt hearings on his motion to withdraw his guilty plea instead became a series of postponements that stretched through 2020 and into 2021. Each delayed court date was another blow to Kim Devins and her family. They would prepare emotionally for hearings that would then be canceled or moved to dates months in the future. The uncertainty was almost as painful as the original loss, keeping wounds open that should have been allowed to heal. "Every time we get ready for court, I have to relive what happened to Bianca," Kim explained during one of many interviews she gave during this period. "Every postponement means more sleepless nights, more anxiety, more time that her killer isn't being held accountable." The courthouse itself had implemented strict COVID-19 protocols that limited attendance and required masks and social distancing. The already sterile environment of legal proceedings became even more impersonal, with participants separated by plexiglass barriers and technological difficulties interrupting virtual hearings. Clark's defense team used the delays to their advantage, filing additional motions and requesting evaluations that further prolonged the process. Each new filing required responses from prosecutors, additional hearings, and more opportunities for postponement. The calendar pages filled with crossed-out dates and rescheduled appointments became a visual representation of the family's suffering. January became February, February became March, and still, no resolution appeared on the horizon. Kim began to worry that the delays were deliberate, that Clark's legal team was hoping the case would somehow be forgotten or that witnesses would become unavailable. The strategy seemed designed to exhaust the prosecution and the victim's family, rather than to actually defend their client. "Justice delayed is justice denied," Kim said at a victims' rights rally held outside the courthouse. "My daughter has been dead for over a year, and her killer is still trying to escape responsibility. This has to end." Legal experts explained that plea withdrawal motions were complex and required careful consideration by judges, but the explanations provided little comfort to a family that had already endured so much uncertainty. The technical requirements of due process seemed to conflict with their need for closure and finality. The media coverage during this period focused on the broader implications of the case for digital violence and platform responsibility, but Kim's focus remained singular. She wanted Brandon Andrew Clark to be held accountable for murdering her daughter. As 2021 began, nearly 2 years after Bianca's death, the family was still waiting for a final resolution to the legal case that had consumed their lives. The delays had become another form of victimization, extending their trauma far beyond what anyone had anticipated when Clark first entered his guilty plea. While waiting for the legal system to provide justice, Kim Devins channeled her grief into action that could prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma. The proposed legislation that became known as Bianca's Law represented her determination to create meaning from senseless loss. The law aimed to hold social media platforms accountable for removing violent content within specific time frames and to create criminal penalties for sharing graphic images of violence without consent. It was ambitious legislation that challenged the traditional legal protections enjoyed by tech companies. Kim testified before legislative committees in New York and other states, her voice steady as she described the ongoing trauma her family experienced every time someone shared images of Bianca's death. Her testimony was powerful, not because it was emotional, but because it was grounded in concrete proposals for legal reform. No family should have to beg corporations to remove images of their loved one's murder, Kim told lawmakers. No teenager should have to worry that their worst moment could become entertainment for strangers on the internet. The legislative efforts attracted support from victims' rights organizations, child safety advocates, and some technology policy experts who had long argued for stronger platform accountability. But they also faced opposition from digital rights groups who worried about the implications for free speech and platform liability. Kim found herself navigating complex political and legal terrain that she had never expected to encounter. She learned about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the federal law that generally protects platforms from liability for user-generated content. She studied similar cases from other states and consulted with attorneys who specialized in technology law. The advocacy work provided a sense of purpose during the long months of legal delays. While she couldn't control when Clark would finally be sentenced, she could work to ensure that his crime contributed to systemic changes that would protect other young people. Bianca believed in using creativity to make the world better, Kim said during a speech at a technology policy conference. This legislation is my way of honoring that belief. Her death has to mean something more than just tragedy. The proposed law faced significant hurdles. Tech companies lobbied against it, arguing that existing tools for reporting violent content were sufficient. Some legal experts questioned whether state-level legislation could effectively regulate platforms that operated globally. But Kim's advocacy had already achieved something important. It had transformed Bianca from a victim into a catalyst for change. The teenager who had been known primarily for the circumstances of her death was now associated with efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The legislative battle would continue for years, with mixed results in different states. But the effort itself demonstrated the power of turning grief into action, of refusing to let tragedy define the end of a story. Bianca Michelle Devins had lived her entire life in Utica, New York, but her story had traveled around the world. News outlets from London to Tokyo covered the case as an example of how digital platforms could amplify violence beyond anything previous generations had experienced. The international attention brought both support and additional scrutiny to Kim's advocacy efforts. Reporters from major newspapers and television networks sought interviews about Bianca's Law and the broader implications of the case for internet regulation. This isn't just an American problem, Kim explained during a video conference with European journalists. Social media platforms operate globally, and the violence they can spread affects families everywhere. We need international cooperation to address this issue. The global coverage also attracted attention from researchers and policy experts who were studying digital violence. Bianca's case became a reference point in academic papers, policy discussions, and technology conferences around the world. But the international attention also had a darker side. The same global connectivity that allowed Kim's advocacy to reach worldwide audiences also meant that the images Clark had posted continued to circulate on platforms and in forums that were difficult to monitor or regulate. Kim received messages from people in dozens of countries who had encountered the images or heard about the case. Some offered support and shared similar experiences from their own community. Others were less helpful, treating Bianca's death as entertainment or using it to advance their own political agendas. The global dimension of the case highlighted the limitations of national-level solutions to digital violence. A law passed in New York might affect how American platforms operated, but it would have no impact on sites hosted in other countries or on the dark web forums where violent content often migrated. At a United Nations conference on digital rights, Kim spoke about the need for international cooperation to address online violence. Her appearance was brief but powerful, representing the voice of families who had been affected by crimes that transcended traditional jurisdictional boundaries. "My daughter was killed in a car on a road in upstate New York," Kim told the international audience. "But his crime reached people in every country represented in this room. That's the reality we have to address." The global attention validated Kim's belief that Bianca's case represented something larger than a single tragedy. It was a symbol of how technology had changed the nature of violence and victimization, creating new forms of harm that traditional legal systems were struggling to address. But even as her advocacy reached international audiences, Kim's primary focus remained local and personal, ensuring that Brandon Andrew Clark was finally held accountable for murdering her daughter. Judge Michael Dwyer's written decision was delivered on a gray March morning in 2021, nearly 2 years after Bianca Michelle Devins had been murdered and more than a year after Brandon Andrew Clark had entered his guilty plea. The ruling was unequivocal. Clark's motion to withdraw his guilty plea was denied. The judge found that the plea had been entered knowingly and voluntarily, with adequate legal representation, and that the defendant's subsequent claims of mental health issues did not justify allowing him to reverse his admission of guilt. Kim Devins was in the courtroom when the decision was read aloud. As the judge explained his reasoning, she felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and exhaustion. The legal uncertainty that had consumed nearly 2 years of her life was finally over. Mr. Clark's guilty plea was clear and unambiguous. "To not be create ness," Judge Dwyer stated. "The evidence supporting his guilt is overwhelming." His attempt to withdraw the plea appears to be motivated by a desire to avoid the consequences of his actions, rather than by any legitimate concern about the voluntariness of his original decision. The decision referenced the digital evidence that Clark himself had created, noting that few murder cases in the court's history had featured such comprehensive documentation by the perpetrator himself. The images he had posted online, intended to maximize trauma and attention, had instead become the evidence that ensured his conviction would stand. Clark sat silently as the ruling was read, showing no visible reaction to the judge's words. His defense attorneys had exhausted their primary strategy for avoiding the consequences of his guilty plea, and the path forward led inevitably to sentencing. Outside the courthouse, Kim spoke to reporters with a composure that had been forged through months of uncertainty and legal delays. The decision represented not just a legal victory, but validation of her faith in the justice system despite its imperfections. "Today, the court confirmed what we've known all along," she said. "Brandon Clark murdered my daughter, and he must be held accountable for that crime. This ruling brings us one step closer to justice for Bianca." The decision was covered extensively in local and national media, with legal experts praising Judge Dwyer's thorough analysis of the plea withdrawal motion. The ruling was seen as particularly significant because it prevented what could have been a lengthy and traumatic trial. For Kim, the ruling meant that she could finally begin to prepare for the sentencing hearing, the final chapter in a legal process that had dominated her life since her daughter's death. After nearly 2 years of uncertainty, she could see the end of the road. The guilty plea would stand. Brandon Andrew Clark would face the consequences of his actions, and Bianca Michelle Devins would finally receive the justice her family had fought so hard to secure. The sentencing hearing took place on a spring morning that felt heavy with the weight of nearly 2 years of legal proceedings. The courtroom was filled with Bianca's family members, friends, and community supporters who had followed the case from its horrific beginning to this moment of reckoning. Brandon Andrew Clark was brought into the courtroom in shackles, his appearance markedly different from the young man who had murdered Bianca in 2019. The legal process had aged him, but there was still no visible indication that he truly understood the magnitude of what he had done. Before sentencing, Kim Devins was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement. She had spent weeks preparing her remarks, wanting to capture not just the pain of losing Bianca, but the broader impact of Clark's actions on their family and community. "Brandon Clark didn't just kill my daughter," Kim began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "He killed her twice, once with a knife, and again by posting those images online for the world to see. He stole her dignity, her privacy, and our ability to grieve in peace. She spoke about Bianca's dreams, her artistic talents, her plans for college and career. She described the teenager Clark had murdered as a complete person with hopes and relationships and potential that would never be realized. Bianca was 17 years old. She should be in college now, studying art, making friends, falling in love, building a life. Instead, she's remembered primarily for how she died, because that's what Brandon Clark chose to share with the world. Kim's statement also addressed the broader implications of the case for digital violence and platform responsibility. She spoke about the ongoing trauma her family experienced every time someone shared the images Clark had posted, and the need for systemic changes to prevent similar crimes. When she finished speaking, Judge Dwyer turned to Clark and asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. Clark's response was brief and seemed to focus more on his own circumstances than on the harm he had caused to others. The sentence was exactly what New York law prescribed for second-degree murder: 25 years to life in prison. Clark would be eligible for parole consideration after serving 25 years, but there was no guarantee he would ever be released. Mr. Clark, you have committed one of the most heinous crimes this court has ever seen, Judge Dwyer said as he imposed the sentence. Your actions not only took a young woman's life, but caused immeasurable trauma to her family, friends, and community. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes and society's condemnation of your actions. The gavel came down with finality, marking the end of the legal process that had consumed nearly 2 years of the Devins family's lives. Outside the courthouse, Kim spoke to reporters one final time about the criminal case. Today, justice was served for Bianca, she said. While nothing can bring my daughter back, knowing that her killer will spend the rest of his life in prison provides some measure of closure for our family. The walk from the courthouse felt different than all the previous times Kim Devins had made that journey. For nearly 2 years, she had entered and exited the building with uncertainty hanging over her head, never knowing when the next delay or legal maneuver would extend their ordeal. Now, with Brandon Andrew Clark sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, that uncertainty was finally gone. The criminal case was over. Her daughter's killer would spend decades behind bars, possibly the rest of his life. Family members and supporters gathered around Kim on the courthouse steps, offering embraces and words of comfort. Some had attended every hearing, sitting in the gallery as a show of support during the family's darkest moments. Others had traveled from out of state specifically for the sentencing. I feel like I can finally breathe again, Kim told a close friend as they walked away from the media attention. For the first time in 2 years, I know what's going to happen next. The relief was palpable, but it was mixed with other emotions that were harder to define. Justice had been served, but Bianca was still gone. Clark's sentence provided accountability, but it couldn't restore the future that had been stolen from a 17-year-old girl. In the days following the sentencing, Kim found herself processing emotions she hadn't had time to address during the long legal battle. The anger, grief, and determination that had sustained her through court hearings and media interviews gave way to a more complex mixture of loss and hope. The criminal case was over, but Kim's advocacy work was far from finished. Bianca's law continued to move through legislative processes in multiple states. Civil lawsuits against social media platforms remained pending. The fight to prevent similar tragedies was ongoing. But for the first time since July 2019, Kim could focus on that advocacy work without the distraction and emotional drain of criminal proceedings. She could honor Bianca's memory without constantly reliving the details of her murder in courtrooms and legal filings. The sentencing had provided what legal experts call closure. But Kim was learning that closure in the aftermath of violent crime was more complicated than the term suggested. The criminal case was closed, but the impact of Clark's actions would continue to affect her family and community for years to come. Still, walking away from the courthouse after the sentencing felt like crossing a threshold. The worst part of their legal nightmare was behind them. They could begin today, move forward, carrying Bianca's memory in ways that honored her life rather than just her death. 6 months after Brandon Andrew Clark's sentencing, the city of Utica dedicated a memorial garden to Bianca Michelle Devins in a park near her family's home. The ceremony drew hundreds of people from the community and beyond, many carrying flowers, artwork, and personal items to honor her memory. The garden featured plants and flowers that bloomed throughout the growing season, ensuring that color and life would mark the space year-round. At the center was a bench with a plaque that quoted one of Bianca's favorite artists, "Create something beautiful from the pain." Kim Devins spoke at the dedication ceremony, but her remarks focused on celebration rather than tragedy. She talked about Bianca's artistic talents, her kindness to friends, her dreams of studying art in college, For perhaps the first time since her daughter's death, the public conversation centered on how Bianca had lived rather than how she had died. "This garden represents the beauty that Bianca brought to the world," Kim told the crowd. "Every flower that blooms here is a reminder that her life mattered, that she was more than what happened to her in those final moments." Local artists had contributed pieces for the garden, creating a space that reflected the creative community where Bianca had thrived. High school students from her former art classes painted a mural on a nearby wall, depicting scenes of hope and renewal that captured her optimistic spirit. The ceremony included performances by musicians who had been influenced by Bianca's online presence and advocacy. Their songs spoke of resilience, justice, and the power of memory to transform pain into purpose. But the most powerful moment came when Kim read names and brief descriptions of other young people who had been victims of digital violence. Bianca's case had brought attention to a problem that affected families across the country, and the Dawn Memorial Ceremony acknowledged that broader community of loss and healing. "Bianca's story doesn't end with her death," Kim said as the ceremony concluded. "It continues every time someone takes action to protect young people online, every time someone chooses kindness over cruelty, every time someone creates something beautiful from pain." The Memorial Garden became a place where people could process their own experiences with online harassment, digital violence, and the loss of young lives to preventable tragedies. Teachers brought students to discuss internet safety. Families visited to remember their own lost loved ones. Artists came to find inspiration for work that honored victims of violence. The healing represented by the garden was incomplete and ongoing. Scars from Clark's actions remained, both for Bianca's immediate family and for the broader community that had been traumatized by his online posts. But the space provided a focal point for remembering Bianca as she had been in life: creative, hopeful, and loved. 2 years after her daughter's death, Kim Devins sat before a New York State legislative committee, testifying in support of legislation that would hold social media platforms accountable for removing violent content. The hearing room was filled with lawmakers, lobbyists, and advocates on various sides of the digital policy debate. Bianca's law had evolved since Kim first began advocating for it in the aftermath of her daughter's murder. The current version focused on creating penalties for platforms that failed to remove graphic violent content within specified timeframes and establishing victim compensation funds for families affected by digital violence. Kim's testimony was factual and measured, grounded in specific examples of how the images Clark had posted continued to circulate despite repeated requests for removal. She had documentation of her communications with various platforms, showing the inadequacy of existing content moderation systems. 2 years after my daughter's murder, I still receive messages from people who have encountered these images, Kim told the committee. Every time someone sees them, Bianca is victimized again, and our family is forced to relive our worst moments. The legislation faced opposition from technology companies and digital rights organizations who argued that existing reporting mechanisms were sufficient and that newfound regulations could impact legitimate speech. Their representatives testified that the proposed law was too broad and could have unintended consequences for platform operations. But Kim's advocacy had gained support from other families affected by digital violence, creating a broader coalition that gave weight to her testimony. Parents from across the country had contacted her office to share similar experiences with online harassment, cyberbullying, and the spread of violent imagery. The hearing included testimony from technology experts who explained the technical challenges of content moderation at scale. They acknowledged that no automated system could catch all problematic content, but they also agreed that platforms could do more to prioritize the removal of violent imagery. "We're not asking for perfection," Kim explained during questioning from committee members. "We're asking for accountability. When families report that images of their loved ones' murders are circulating online, platforms should be required to take swift action." The legislative process was slow and complex, involving multiple committees, amendments, and negotiations between different stakeholders. Kim learned to navigate political realities that sometimes conflicted with her desire for comprehensive reform. Some aspects of the original Bianca's law proposal were modified or removed during the legislative process. The final version that passed in New York was narrower than what Kim had initially advocated for, but it still represented meaningful progress in platform accountability. The law's passage was celebrated by victims' rights advocates and Kim's supporters, but she viewed it as just one step in a longer campaign for digital safety reform. Similar legislation was being considered in other states, and she continued to testify and advocate wherever her voice could make a difference. Bianca would be proud that her story is helping to protect other young people, Kim said after the law was signed. This is how we honor her memory, by working to ensure that other families don't have to experience what we went through. In addition to her legislative advocacy, Kim Devins pursued civil litigation against social media platforms that had failed to promptly remove the images Brandon Andrew Clark had posted of Bianca's murder. The lawsuits challenged the traditional legal protections that technology companies enjoyed under federal law. The civil cases were more complex than the criminal prosecution of Clark. While his guilt was never in doubt, the question of platform liability involved intricate legal theories about corporate responsibility, content moderation, and the balance between free speech and victim protection. Kim's legal team argued that the platforms had been negligent in their response to reports about the violent imagery, and that this negligence had caused additional harm to Bianca's family and memory. They documented the spread of the images across multiple platforms and the inadequacy of content removal efforts. The lawsuits attracted attention from legal scholars who studied technology law and corporate accountability. Some viewed the cases as important tests of whether existing legal frameworks were adequate for addressing digital age harms. Others worried about the implications for platform operations and online speech. The platforms responded with motions to dismiss the suits, citing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which generally protects Internet companies from liability for user-generated content. Their attorneys argued that holding platforms liable for user posts would fundamentally change how the Internet operated. These companies profit from user engagement, including engagement with violent and traumatic content. Kim's attorney argued during one hearing, they have a responsibility to implement systems that can quickly identify and remove the most harmful material, especially when families are begging them to take action. The litigation process was lengthy and emotionally draining for Kim, requiring depositions, document production, and detailed reconstruction of the platform's response to reports about the violent images. Each filing required her to relive aspects of the trauma her family had experienced. Some of the suits were dismissed by lower courts, while others survived initial motions and proceeded toward trial. The mixed results reflected the unsettled state of law regarding platform liability for user-generated content. Even when courts ruled against the family's claims, the litigation served important purposes. It generated media coverage that kept attention focused on digital violence issues. It created legal precedents that future cases could build upon. It demonstrated that families affected by online harms wouldn't accept corporate indifference without a fight. The civil suits also provided Kim with a platform to continue educating the public about the real-world consequences of online violence. Court filings became opportunities to document the ongoing impact of Clark's actions on her family and community. Win or lose, these cases are about accountability, Kim explained to reporters covering the litigation. These companies need to understand that there are real people behind the content they host, and real consequences when they fail to protect those people from harm. 3 years after Bianca's murder, Kim Devins appeared on a national television news program to discuss the ongoing fight for digital safety reform. The Fox interview was part of a broader segment about online violence and platform responsibility that had been prompted by several high-profile cases similar to Bianca's. The interviewer introduced Kim as a mother who turned tragedy into advocacy, but she quickly redirected the conversation to focus on systemic issues rather than her personal story. Her media appearances had evolved from expressions of grief to sophisticated policy discussions about technology regulation. This isn't just about my daughter, though her case brought national attention to these issues, Kim explained. There are families across the country dealing with similar situations, cyberbullying, harassment, violent imagery, and they need better legal protections. The television appearance was part of Kim's broader effort to keep digital violence issues in the national conversation. She had spoken at conferences, written op-ed articles, and participated in policy forums that brought together technology experts, legislators, and advocacy organizations. Her advocacy had helped establish Bianca's case as a reference point in discussions about internet safety and platform accountability. Academic researchers cited the case in studies of digital violence. Technology policy experts referenced it in congressional testimony. News outlets used it as an example when covering related stories. The national conversation had evolved since 2019, with increased attention to the mental health impacts of social media, the spread of harmful content, and the responsibilities of technology companies. Kim's advocacy had contributed to that evolution, helping to center the voices of affected families in policy discussions. "We're seeing progress," Kim told the television audience. "More states are considering legislation similar to Bianca's law. Platforms are implementing better reporting systems. The conversation is changing, even if the change isn't happening as quickly as we'd like." The interview also addressed the ongoing challenges Kim faced in her advocacy work. The legal protections for technology companies remain strong at the federal level. Some proposed reforms faced opposition from digital rights organizations concerned about free speech implications. But Kim's message had evolved to include hope alongside critique. She spoke about young people who had contacted her after learning internet safety skills through educational programs inspired by Bianca's story. She highlighted technology companies that had improved their content moderation systems in response to advocacy pressure. Bianca believed in using creativity to make positive changes in the world. Kim concluded during the interview, "That's what we're trying to do through this advocacy work, honor her memory by creating a safer digital environment for young people." The television appearance was watched by millions of viewers, many of whom were parents concerned about their own children's online safety. Kim's combination of personal authority and policy expertise made her an effective spokesperson for digital reform efforts. 5 years after Bianca Michelle Devins was murdered, her name had become associated not primarily with the circumstances of her death, but with efforts to create a safer digital world for young people. The tragedy that had shattered her family's life had been transformed into a catalyst for positive change. Schools across the country were using educational materials developed by Kim Devins and digital safety organizations to teach students about online responsibility, platform accountability, and the real-world consequences of digital violence. The curriculum used Bianca's story as a starting point for broader discussions about internet citizenship. "We talk about Bianca as a real person who had dreams and talents and people who loved her," explained one teacher who used the materials in her high school classes. "Students understand that there are real human beings behind online profiles, and that our digital actions can have profound impacts on other people's lives." The educational programs had reached thousands of students, parents, and educators. Feedback from participants suggested that learning about Bianca's case had influenced how young people thought about their own online behavior and the content they chose to share or amplify. Kim continued her advocacy work, but it had evolved from crisis response to systematic reform efforts. She served on advisory boards for digital safety organizations, consulted with technology companies on content moderation policies, and worked with legislators on updated approaches to platform accountability. Bianca's law had been passed in several states, though in modified forms that reflected the complex political and legal realities of technology regulation. The legislation hadn't solved all the problems Kim had identified, but it represented meaningful progress in holding platforms accountable for violent content. The civil litigation against social media platforms had produced mixed results, with some cases dismissed and others settled out of court. But the legal efforts had contributed to increased corporate attention to content moderation and family support systems. Perhaps most importantly, Kim had helped establish a community of families and advocates working on digital safety issues. Parents who had experienced online harassment, cyberbullying, or digital violence found resources and support through networks that had grown from Bianca's case. "I wish I could say that we've solved the problem," Kim reflected during an interview marking the 5th anniversary of Bianca's death, "but we've made real progress in raising awareness, changing policies, and supporting families who face similar tragedies." The Memorial Garden in Utica had become a pilgrimage site for people affected by digital violence, with visitors leaving flowers, artwork, and personal notes throughout the year. The space served as a reminder that behind every case of online harm was a real person with family and friends who mourned their loss. Bianca's story had become larger than the tragedy that ended her life. It had become a call to action, a reminder of human dignity in digital spaces, and a testament to the power of turning grief into advocacy for positive change. In high schools where her story was taught, in legislative chambers where Bianca's law was debated, in technology companies where content policies were revised, the name Bianca Michelle Devins represented something more than victimhood. It represented the possibility of creating meaning from loss, of protecting future generations from digital violence, and of ensuring that young people could explore online spaces safely. Her legacy was written not just in the laws that bore her name or the educational programs that used her story, but in the countless individual decisions by young people to choose kindness over cruelty, by platforms to prioritize safety over engagement, and by families to transform their pain into purpose. 5 years after her death, Bianca Michelle Devins was remembered not primarily as a victim of violence, but as a catalyst for change, a 17-year-old whose artistic spirit had inspired a movement to make the digital world more humane.